thanks. So we have got a lot to get through. So I'm going to warn you right now that I have like 100 slides here. It's more than what I would normally cover. So we're going to do our best to get through it all and still have room for questions. But at some point you may see me suddenly just skip forward a little bit if I think we're starting to run behind time, because some bits of this are going to be much more valuable than others to most of the people that are here. So I think I've already been introduced. I'm a senior accessibility consultant at Nomensa. We're a strategy UX agency. We do a lot of accessibility consultancy. I did the Lunch and Learn last month as well, so you can always go back and watch that. But today we're just going to be looking at prioritization, how you, after an audit or after you've got loads and loads of issues, what you do with them and how you organize it all. So there's quite a lot that we're going to try and get through. We're going to look at different findings, how you take an audit report and how you break it down into a meaningful way. So most websites have a lot of accessibility issues. They're not designed and built with accessibility in mind. So when we audit a website, we tend to find a lot of issues. I'm a particularly details-focused person. There's a few people I know who are in attendance who I've looked at their solutions, front-end developers and things before, so you know that the way I give feedback is very, very, very detailed. It's not unusual for me to find 100 or more separate issues. Sometimes the instances of those issues will run into thousands. So when we do accessibility audits for our clients, either to support a remediation effort or to provide insight into accessibility capability, we will deliver at the end a big report and talk them through all of the findings. And sadly, the unfortunate reality is that most designers and developers know very little about accessibility. The default education routes for designers and developers do not include accessibility. Architecture, they have to know about the built environment and accessibility. It's like essential, but it's not really considered so essential or as essential as it should be. My biggest bugbear is that developers aren't taught HTML. They're just sort of expected to learn it in a couple of hours. Similarly, designers have very little experience or exposure to the different needs that people may have and the different ways they might interact with digital interfaces. And if they don't have the awareness, they won't build in the alternatives and won't have considered accessibility early enough in that design process. So as a result, it's very easy to accidentally introduce accessibility issues in every project by default. This is just what happens. You introduce them, whether you mean to or not. I don't think anyone intentionally does it. It just sort of happens. And most organizations are completely overwhelmed by the number of accessibility issues that we find, because you can imagine what it's like. You sort of say, oh, can you have a look at my website? Tell me how accessible it is. And then they're handed a report with hundreds of issues in it. Oh, what do we do with it? And it can be really hard to understand the challenges that people are facing. And a very quick test is normally enough to expose a lot of issues. You don't want to overwhelm people. So the whole point of creating this sort of backlog project is to be able to break it down into manageable chunks. And running prioritization workshops is how we like to do this. So helping clients break up their issues into manageable little chunks where they can tackle them in an efficient, effective, ordered, and the most impactful way. So it's also an activity that you can run on your own mini projects. So I think it's quite a good practice to learn for all levels of project, learn how to look for a few accessibility issues. Even if you're not an expert, you don't have to find everything, but learning then what to do with those issues and how to feed them into a backlog of fixes and improvements is a really valuable skill for all sorts of people to learn, no matter what your role is. And my little caveat here is if you can avoid introducing the issues in the first place or find and fix them early, that is going to be way better than waiting till much later on, having an audit done, and then having this huge long list of remediation things you've got to do. The ideal approach is to avoid introducing them at all. So to find and fix them as early as possible, even at design stage. So you'll commonly hear this referred to as shifting left, because we For those of us who read in sort of English language, we read left to right. So we say shift left, move things earlier in the process. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to look at what we mean by accessibility issues, what I'm talking about there. We're going to look at how those issues vary, touch on very quickly how you find them, and then go into more detail about how you run one of these workshops and tips for success. So what do we mean by accessibility issues? Accessibility issues are any barriers that make it difficult or impossible for disabled users to access, navigate, or engage with your digital content. When we share issues, we find we group them by different interaction types. That's quite a good frame when you're thinking about these issues, because it helps to bring to life that we're trying to avoid barriers. We're trying to avoid exclusion that people really experience, rather than just focusing on meeting a checklist. You know, a lot of you will have heard of the WCAG checklist, or the accessibility requirements that you need to make. And we don't want to just approach it in a way where we're just doing this thing because someone said so. Instead, we want to reframe our thinking to focus on the fact that real people cannot do what they need to do if you've introduced those barriers. That's why we're doing this. So the type of accessibility issues we're talking about, keyboard, really common issue. So links, buttons, and form inputs not being keyboard accessible. So the first thing I'll do on a website I see is I'll try and use it by keyboard only. So I'll press tab and try and move through all the interactive elements on the page. I might use arrow keys, enter keys to activate forms, that kind of thing. You can catch stuff really quickly that way. Another keyboard one, navigation order not being logical or intuitive. It can be very confusing for keyboard users and particularly for screen reader users. So we've got an image there showing a not accessible and accessible version, so of a form. So in the first one, the form is jumping from the first input right down to postcode, and then it's going back up to city, and then it's going to the state. In the accessible one, the focus order is moving in the exact same way that it's presented visually, so it makes more sense. Another keyboard one is not being able to see which control has focus while navigating with a keyboard. This one's a really big one for me. I navigate by keyboard almost exclusively when I'm browsing websites, and if I can't see where I'm focused, I just get lost so quickly. Another keyboard is links not being available to skip past a big list of navigation links. So this WCAG criterion is called the bypass blocks. So that just means you should always have a link at the top that says skip to main content. You don't need it if you don't have a big navigation at the top, but it's more of a way of allowing people just to get past that content and get to what they really are on that page for. Low vision. You could have text controls and essential icons having a lack of color contrast. We've got a little image there showing two examples where you can hardly see the text because it's really faint, and another one where it's nice and clear. Color blindness. So one accessibility issue is color being used as the only way to convey information. So got a few examples there. So some image that shows some little coloured markers that are meant to mean something. Two of them are green and one of them is red. That's not accessible because we don't know what those mean. If you've got red-green colour blindness, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between any of those. So on the accessible version, there's a little text label on the middle one just to show you what that means. Screen reader issues. So content being read out in an illogical order by screen readers. So I've got some examples of some cards there where you're strangely kind of going from card to card in the first one, where that order is illogical. The content order doesn't make sense when a screen reader is reading it. And then an example underneath where the content goes through card by card instead of moving between them. So it's more accessible. Another screen reader one is images not having meaningful alternative text. So an example here is quite a complex image. I think this was on BBC News website quite a long time ago, this, because it's going back to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there's loads of detail in the image. It's showing what all the different political parties, which number of MPs voted for which thing, but the alt text doesn't convey that information. It just gives a summary of the information, of what the conclusion of what that information is showing, but it doesn't show any of the detail. So images not having meaningful alt text when they are meaningful images can be a real problem, because a screen reader will not get the same experience. Another screen reader problem is a form input button, error text, or visual notification not being available. So my image there is showing a screen reader. It's actually the voiceover rotor menu focused on an input that is visibly labeled last name, but programmatically it has no label because it's not been associated. So for a screen reader, they would just hear that announced as a generic text input. They wouldn't know what that's for. So that can be very confusing. You're trying to go through a form and every single input is unlabeled. Another one for screen readers that's a really simple one for front-end developers to get right if they think about HTML is headings, lists, buttons, links, tables, not using appropriate HTML. So when the appropriate HTML isn't used, the content just can't be interpreted properly by screen readers. It's very hard to understand the information and relationships between different pieces of content and the structure of the overall content. So I've got two images on this slide. One is showing that some sections, some what should be titles, have just been written as divs, so they're not headings. And the good example shows that you've got H1 at the top, then you've got H2s lower down for the next sections of content. Another screen reader issue is interface components, that's UI components, not using appropriate ARIA or lacking expected keyboard behavior. And I think there's a lot of confusion about ARIA, and that is it's a little bit harder to learn. The focus of ARIA is about role and state most of the time. It's what the element is and what its state is and relationships between different things. So it's what controls what. The image I've got here is a screenshot from a very good site. You can look it up, Nutrition Cards for Accessible Components. It's very similar to the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, which gives all the same sort of information, and will tell you what keyboard expectations are, what the accessibility requirements are for different common user interface patterns, such as tabs. So in those, we would expect certain things, and screen readers would expect certain things to be able to understand which tab is active, to know what controls they use, to be able to open and close different tabs. If you don't get that right in the code, then their expectations won't be met and they will struggle to use that interface. Thinking about deafness. So a podcast not having a text transcript would be a complete blocker for them. You need to have text transcripts, same with videos and things. You need to be able to have a text version, like an alternative, to be able to, for people who are deaf, who can't hear it, to be able to get the same information. Another example would be on videos not having captions. So that would also affect people who are deaf, not being able to experience the same information. And then we think about cognitive as an interaction mode. So a form not clearly indicating which fields are invalid or providing useless error messages would be an example of a barrier there. So the example that I've got in images is one great form that has very clear error messages next to each field. It's showing up, it says there's an error icon there. It says, please enter a valid email address, please enter a valid phone number. So you know where there's an error, you know that there's something wrong and you know how to fix it. But then there's a bad example in there of an old Internet Explorer alert that probably a lot of the people on this call might not even be old enough to remember seeing these sort of errors, but you used to see it a lot and it would pop up and it would just say unknown error, which is completely useless, and you wouldn't know how to fix it. So all of these issues are covered by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.2. There are 86 success criteria if you include AAA which most people don't. Most websites are only aiming to hit the AA level. But if you don't count the AAA, you just look at level A and level AA, then there's 55 success criteria that you need to meet. But I want to make it very clear that WCAG does not cover all accessibility issues. The goal should not be to meet WCAG. The goal should be to ensure that there are no barriers. So irrespective of whether they're found in the current iteration of WCAG or not, these guidelines are a tool to help you make a site accessible rather than being a goal of what you need to meet. These criteria that most websites already struggle to meet is actually only the baseline. Real usability is the goal. So moving on to how different issues vary. Not all issues are equal. This is really important to get your head round. It's a common mistake in people's thinking because they see a big list of issues and they think that they are all equally important. They're just like, oh, I just need to fix them all. And you do, but you also need to be much more pragmatic about what to fix, when, and how. And the way you do that, we're going to go over in quite a lot more detail. So not all issues that are barriers actually fail the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, unfortunately. I do come across things that I know are definite barriers, definite frustrations, but they don't actually fit into one of the WCAG criteria as it stands. So in those cases, we have to call them best practice. So in our reports, we'll always indicate which success criteria has failed, which level of WCAG that criteria is, so whether it's A or AA, and if the issue doesn't fail a success criterion at the desired level, we'll still include it in the report. So those are the items that I list as best practice items. And if your goal is to provide the best experience to as many people as possible, then you should be fixing all issues. If your goal is completely compliance focused and your main goal is just to meet the guidelines, it may be that you just choose to focus on the fails, or at least in phase 1, you just focus on the actual fails, you move on to best practice ones later. That can change depending on where they're found in a website or in an app. And when performing manual accessibility testing, the more knowledgeable the person is in accessibility, the more issues they're going to find. So like I said, I'm really detailed, so I find a lot. And I usually include quite a lot of best practice items as standard. And issues can present a different degree of barrier to people, from being a complete blocker to just being a minor frustration. So as well as listing all the issues and categorizing them by the WCAG criterion or best practice, we also mark every issue as blocker, severe, moderate, minor. If it's best practice, it will either go under one of those, or we can just list it as best practice as well. But that helps to give you a little bit of degree of the severity of the barrier. So looking at degrees of barriers, when we talk of blockers, these are the issues that are really serious. These are the ones that definitely completely prevent some people from accessing content or completing a task. So the example I gave before, links, buttons, and form inputs not being keyboard accessible, that's an immediate blocker. If I can't use it with keyboard, it means none of the other assistive technologies are going to work either. It's a blocker for a lot of people. We'd still list it under keyboard as the interaction mode. We'd still list it as a blocker, even though it would probably also affect screen readers. Colorblind, if you're using color as the only way to convey information, that's a complete blocker. If there's no label, if someone is colorblind, they will not be able to understand that information. A podcast not having a text transcript, that would be a blocker. A video not having captions, that would be a blocker. Looking at severe, some issues are not quite blockers because there's a workaround. So it might still be a serious frustration and something might still be really hard to use, but there is a workaround that can be used to bypass the issue. So an example of a severe issue might be pinch to zoom being disabled. So someone can't pinch to zoom on their device. That is really, really frustrating for them, but they might be able to do something else. They might be able to just like click zoom in. They might be able to enlarge text on their device or go into their settings and change it, change orientation, do other things to be able to get around it, even though it's a frustration. Content being lost when text is made bigger. So I do this a lot. It's why I bang on to front-end developers about using rem for font sizes so that they will also resize. If content's all being cut off and becoming obscured when text is made bigger, that's severe. But there are other ways around. People could turn the text resizing off. They can zoom in other ways. They can use screen magnification. Text controls and essential icons having a lack of color contrast. That can be moderate sometimes, other times it can be severe. There is a certain amount of nuance depending on what the specific item is. A screen reader example of a severe issue is form inputs, buttons, errors, etc. not being available, so not being accessibly named in the code. I've marked it as a severe for me. Some other people might mark it as moderate, but for me, not being able to see keyboard focus is a severe issue. And then thinking about moderate when we're talking about severity. So some issues present a frustration rather than a complete barrier. So a moderate issue might be not having a bypass, a skip link at the top of the content. That might be a bit annoying because suddenly with a keyboard, you do have to tab through every single navigation item. So it's a frustration, but it's not the end of the world for them. You can get past it. A moderate screen reader issue might be interface components not using the appropriate ARIA. Or lacking expected keyboard behavior. Again, this could be severe. It could even be blocker. It does depend on what the specifics are. But I'm thinking of things like state not being communicated. So say on an accordion, if someone has left off the ARIA expanded and not communicating the expanded or collapsed state of that accordion, that's frustrating, but you would still be able to work it out by moving on to the next bit of content and finding if it's open or not. You can go back, click it again, then go forward again. So it's frustrating, but it's not severe in that case, and it's not a blocker in that case. And then there's some issues that might be considered minor. So they may fail WCAG, but actually present very little impact to end users. So might include things like focus or reading order not being quite right, missing landmarks, decorative images having alt descriptions, so it just being something else that someone has to listen to, but it's not the end of the world. And I did want to just mention, we used to have this success criteria. This is really, really rare that a success criteria gets removed. This is the only time it's happened. So WCAG 2.2 came out last year, and the decision was made to remove passing as an error. Because this used to come up a lot, and it was very frustrating for auditors like me, because all the genuine problems that were caused by poor markup structure, that's what passing is talking about. It's saying the HTML is invalid for what we expect. But now we've moved on so far that most browsers and assistive technologies have moved on, and they've become more aligned. They don't have the same struggles with invalid HTML that they used to. And all of the genuine problems that really do present an accessibility barrier are already covered by other success criteria. So we don't need to list things under passing anymore, because if it's a real issue, we'll list it on under one of the others. And it's important to remember that the degree of barrier, that severity, can really vary in different scenarios, as I've already touched on. So minor issues might be keyboard navigation order not being logical. It might be content being read out by a screen reader and in a logical order. It might be images not having the right alt text. It might be a form not indicating which fields are invalid. So you have to go through it in reading order to find out where those errors are. And the severity really can be subjective and may have different real life impact for some people. But it's still useful when we're talking about prioritization to try and categorize issues in this way. Usability testing with people with disabilities is the only way that you'll really see the absolutely true impact that someone is facing. So you would need to test with people with various different disabilities to be able to see, and even within that, you know, two people could have exactly the same medically, the same disability, like on paper, but their real experience might be very different. There will be some that will be more tech savvy than others. There will be some people that know how to get around an issue, and for others, they wouldn't. So where I'm saying an issue, that one's a moderate because there's a workaround. If you don't know that workaround exists, well, then it's a blocker for you. So there is a certain amount of nuance in this, but it's still really, really helpful for us to try and categorize things just to start to give that severity thinking onto each issue. So when we think about beyond severity or degree of barrier, you then need to think about the significance of the barrier. And that can vary to different people depending on whether the content or functionality is essential to them. But from a business point of view, most of the time you can think about things as, what is the feature for? What are they trying to achieve? Is that functionality core? Is it essential? Is it secondary or is it tertiary? So we have to consider the significance and how essential is the task where the barrier is present. So core areas of a site might be navigation, registration and login, ability to complete a purchase, anything that you consider to be really core content for your site. Then secondary and tertiary might be non-core content, adverts, newsletters, features like a wish list. Maybe that's a secondary consideration. It's not the most important thing. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work entirely. So it becomes a little bit less important to the business. The next thing we consider is the different layers. So this is more thinking about roles and responsibilities. So issues occur in different layers. They might occur in the content. So that might be things like headings not being used, things being misordered, choosing which components are going to go where on a page. It might be that the content is just written in a really complicated verbose way or has loads of abbreviations in it. It could be all sorts of different things. Sentences that are far too long, probably the way I talk. But you could have accessibility barriers in design. So a common thing might be content getting swapped out. Is quite common, particularly in modern JS built, very highly interactive sites. And maybe there are no annotations in that design of what will happen. There's often things like a confusion between different UI patterns. So on mobile, something is an accordion, but on desktop, it's following a tabs pattern. That kind of thing, that can introduce stuff. You can also have things like typography, colors, interaction in UI, journeys and order, and the use of images and iconography. For design, I think annotations become really, really important on design files if you're going to ensure a truly accessible design. And then there's obviously the code layer. So there's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, ARIA, and there's also the more nuanced things like focus management and using features like the inert attribute so that you can't focus on things that are hidden. And then issues also occur in different locations across a site. So they might occur in a base template. So if I was to scan multiple pages with an automated scanner for accessibility, I might have a really high number of instances based off every single page, but actually, if the problems are all isolated to the header or footer, it's very likely to only need a change in one place because it's at the template level. You could also have issues in the content level, in images, audio and video content, encoded components, so the way components have been designed or built, like pagination, cards, accordions, tabs, auto-suggest, auto-completes. You can have errors in forms. You can also have problems in third-party tools, which make it much harder for you to fix because it won't be your responsibility to do it, like maps, video players, cookie controls, or survey tools that you've pulled into your app. And of course, documents. Documents are also subject to WCAG. PDFs often get ignored. They need to be tagged, they need to be made accessible, or there needs to be accessible alternative versions clearly signposted, which is why we try and drive people towards putting things in HTML and not in downloadable PDFs. And the fact is we can't test everything. So in an audit, I do not attempt to test everything on every page. Instead, we choose a broad representative sample, and we really try and agree with the client ahead. We prioritise core functionality, so whatever they see as core. We'll always do some page level checks, but what we will do is create a test plan for them where we've got a set of pages, and then within those pages, we have chosen a subset of components. Well, generally, a good guide is to think most components are going to take me an hour to test and to write up findings. Some components, if they're really complex and there's loads of changes going on, you might need to break down further. Others, they might be really small and they actually will only take 15 minutes to test. So you want a nice spread of complex and simple components, but you just want to get a representative sample and know that you're not going to cover everything. And when testing a sample of pages, findings need to be applied across the whole site. Just want to make that clear because when people get a report and it's listed as being on 3 pages, they might only then look at those pages. What they will then need to do is find out, has that component been used anywhere else? Or if you're not building in a component-based architecture and it's maybe things that are a problem in a rich text component, so content issues, they are likely to be across a whole site. So you actually need to check everywhere when you're working on remediation effort. Most of the time, when it's component problems, that's easier in modern architectures. So issues are introduced by different people and roles. So you can get accessibility issues introduced at brand level. If a brand color that they want to use across a whole site is going to have a really, really poor contrast, then you might have a little bit of a problem that early on that then needs a tweak. So that brand color will only get used on decorative elements. Visual and UX design can introduce them, development, content authors, and as I mentioned, third-party tools or plugins or content providers. Frequency of an issue can be an important consideration when we're prioritizing. So an issue might just happen once, or it might be duplicated multiple times across a journey. And then the last thing we have to sort of start thinking about is the complexity to fix. So issues can be quick and easy, or they can require a lot of effort. And this is where I will have to take my best guess. When I first prepare ahead of a prioritization workshops, I will estimate how quick and easy I think something will be. But sometimes you'll be presuming that something's going to be really easy, but there might be unknown engineering complexities, or it might have been built in a specific way for a specific reason that you don't have context of, which is the kind of thing that will come out in a prioritization workshop. So as you can see, issues can vary in loads of ways. Severity, the blocker, severe, moderate, minor, significance. So is it a core part of functionality? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? The layer, is it content? Is it design? Is it code? The location within the website or app? Is it in template level, forms, components, documents, by discipline, team or role? So is it brand, is it design, is it dev? So who's responsible? The frequency of it, is it one-off, is it recurring? And the effort to fix. So I like to think of effort to fix as in t-shirt sizes. So is it small, is it medium, is it large? So how do we find all of these issues? So I've talked about audits as if everyone here knows exactly how they are, what they are. I'm not going to go into huge detail about how to run an audit. We definitely don't have time. But how you find them could be automated testing, and if that's what you rely on most. So that's great for getting a really wide coverage of sites. It's good for integrating with a build process, so you can have in your CI pipeline where it automatically will scan at every release. The example images I've got there are 2 automated scans. So one is Axe DevTools, which is a browser extension. There's lots of them. I really like Accessibility Insights. I really like Arc Toolkit. The other one I'm showing there is a Purple Alley scan, so Purple Accessibility Scan. And that was a tool built by the Singapore government. It's really good. You can put a URL for a site in and it will just scan like 100 pages in one go and give you a high level overview. But what these sorts of tests are not good for is depth of coverage. It's not good for telling you that you actually meet the guidelines. They can find false positives sometimes. And really, they're only doing guideline checks. So they can only find between 30 and 50% of issues. So no automated tool, not even these new ones that people are coming out with that say that they're powered on AI and they can definitely solve everything for you. There is no tool that can say you pass WCAG, that you've met all the criteria. It's just not possible without manual testing. So you can do manual testing in different ways as well. So my example here is more like following guidelines, so a checklist. So you might have a load of checkpoints and you're just seeing, does it do this? Does it pass? Does the sequence of content make sense? Is the navigation consistent? Tick, 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 tick. So it's great for per page checks at later stages of development. It's good for getting quite a good coverage depending on what size sample you use. And it's good for saying you've done your bit. You know, it's good for being able to document and demonstrate, I have checked this for accessibility. It's not so good for inexperienced testers. It can be sped up with certain tools, but it's pretty much a manual process. And it will use a subset of sort of translated guidelines that are very specific for an organization. So you've also got to have the time to do this, and you've got to have the time to write these checklists for yourself. Where testing with assistive technology comes in is much better for like checking journeys and tasks. So when I'm doing assistive technology testing, it can take a lot of time, particularly if I want to test with lots of different technologies. So if I'm testing a public sector site, for example, I am going to test it with pretty much every combination and every assistive technology I can. I'm going to go through the same journey, try and do exactly the same task, probably 8 times on different devices, and note down where the barriers are. And what this is good for is it's really good for flushing out things that you didn't spot before. So because if you think about it more task or journey focused, you find where you can't do something or where something was hard to do while you were using that technology. So it's great for checking that sort of thing. It's great for checking for compatibility issues, because sometimes you could use 2 different screen readers and have slightly different results. It's not so good for inexperienced testers. It's not good for those short on time and also on budget, because if you don't have the time to do it and you haven't got the investment in all the different devices or training for the in-depth knowledge of assistive tech, realistically, you're not going to be able to do this in depth. I still think that everyone should get familiar, you know, on your phone, on your different devices, try and get familiar with the accessibility settings, just so you're aware of what's there. And when you can, learn to do little bits of testing. But it does take a lot more effort. And then, of course, there's usability testing. with, so I put PWD there, so people with disabilities. So usability testing with people with genuine disabilities is brilliant for testing something when it's live, when you've got a full working prototype. It's great for prioritizing issues. It's great for learning, and it's great for getting buy-in on stuff. It doesn't happen that often, sadly. It's really the gold standard. But it's quite difficult to cover a lot of a website or application because you just can't get through that many pages. It's more about focusing on a couple of core journeys. And it also means you need a pretty much finished product to test with. So you have to leave this very, very late in the process, which means if there is a core fundamental design problem, that can really scupper things because you've almost got to go right back to the beginning and redesign stuff to be able to test again. And realistically, most projects are not going to have the investment needed for this. So I would say seek feedback from users as much as possible. It's great to have an accessibility statement on a website and to include how people can get back in touch with you, and really pay attention to complaints or pain points and tell your clients to do that. So on to the good stuff with, I think, looking at my clock, well, we're already at like 1:20, so I'm going to try and crack through this. So actually how we run a prioritization workshop. So what's the goal? The goal is to discuss known accessibility issues with people that can provide the insights needed to make prioritization decisions, to capture all the information, and to assign a priority for every issue. So it's about getting the right people in the room. So what we will do is we will set up almost like a really big spreadsheet. So you might use something like Numbers. We've started using Notion, find it really good for that, even though unfortunately Notion is a really inaccessible tool, but at least you can export things from Notion. So you can export them into like a spreadsheet version that could be used there as well. So here's an example for you of the type of thing I'm talking about. So this is an example that has lots and lots of different columns, great big spreadsheet, the default view showing accessibility issues. You can see that there is an interaction mode. So is it keyboard? Is it screen reader? It's been themed. So these are all keyboard issues, but it affects keyboard and screen readers. Got a list of the issues. We've got a layer. So these are all code issues. Who's responsible? So the ones that I'm showing here are developer issues. Who's the job to fix it? Because sometimes you might find that there's different teams. So it might be an external agency, it might be an internal agency, as shown here. Where's the layers of the fixes? Where are the instances? So all these different columns help to start to break stuff down. So we set up the spreadsheet and input known data before the workshop. So everything that I can work out or make educated guesses about, I would do in advance. And you've got to allow plenty of time. For the workshop, I flick it, and the same when I'm doing audit playbacks of my audit findings, I'll order by severity first, so that we really make sure that we focus on the severeness of the barriers so that you get through those blocker issues. So if you run out of time for the minors or the best practice, it's not the end of the world. You've got people into the habit of how to do it and they can carry on in their own time. But as long as you've covered those blockers and severe issues. And getting the right people in the room is really important. So who would actually know what the engineering complexities are around these components? And then within the meeting, so it's quite a long workshop, so usually at least like about half a day, a few hours, a couple of hours at least. You're facilitating discussion, capturing notes and adding in all the detail like the significance, the effort to fix. So that's where I say use a t-shirt size, only has to be broad. And any sort of relevant surrounding issue. So is there a third-party dependency? Oh, we find out when we're in a prioritization workshop that, oh, this one component where we found 30 issues with it, oh, it's about to be rebuilt. So suddenly that becomes a whole different severity almost, or a different urgency to fix because it's already being rebuilt. Will further support be needed to understand the issue or to fix it? And then you assign issues a priority based on that discussion data. So that will vary quite often and depends on how much of the fixes are under your control and the resources available. So issues that are blockers and in core functionality should be the highest priority. Put the blockers and the core right up there. Issues that are moderate or on less critical functionality become a little bit lower priority. So you might have moderate issues, but they're actually in your core functionality. So you might want to push them up. And that will vary from organization to organization, depending on the resources they've got available. Blockers that are going to take a lot of effort to fix may actually be deprioritized due to make a bigger impact by fixing lots of smaller issues. So that's up to the website owner. So if they think we could bash out and fix all of the small issues within the next 2 weeks, we're going to do that first, and then we're going to come back to the blockers, and that will be their choice. So generating different views of the captured data really helps everything. It helps the further discussion, helps the fixes, helps you learn the lessons. So what do I mean by different views? So this is like a priority view. So we've got different columns showing what's now, what's next, what's later, what's unknown, what will be resolved by fixing something else, what's already scheduled to be fixed. So it starts to break things down in a slightly different way. You can then split the view further. So they can be ordered by the team responsible. So now I've got, as well as the columns along the top, sort of different rows, different expando sections saying who's going to fix what. So whose responsibility is it? Which ones are content? Which ones are design? So you can start sort of, everything's becoming much more manageable. So suddenly now individual practitioners are not overwhelmed by just seeing this huge long thing, but they're just seeing their own little row of what they need to consider. Another view of issues by teams responsible. So this is just grouped by teams and then using tagging, all generated from the same spreadsheet data. So this is what Notion's really good for, but you can also do it, I think, in Excel or Numbers or similar. So you can group stuff on different worksheets in different ways, depending on what people need. I also like to do this for my playbacks so that's when I'm explaining my audit findings to a client. I have in my head or on my little notepad some themes, and I try and talk through issues theming. So often I will find that one site might have a lot of problems, say just around labeling controls. They've got a lot of icon buttons and it's all over the site in various different ways, and they've got maybe 10 issues that are all to do with labeling controls and accessible names. So that's one grouping. Another one might be lists. They keep having problems with organizing things into lists, or they might have problems with forms specifically. So you can sort of have topics or tags to help people break stuff down. Breaking these issues down into these chunks, it just makes everything more manageable. So you get the code, design and content fixes, you know what the easy fixes are, you know where the base template fixes are, you know what's yours versus third parties. So top tips for success on doing this. So identify your most important user tasks. So that's the core functionality, and ensure there's no blockers in that. Don't just strive for WCAG compliance. People who are disabled don't care about WCAG. They don't give a monkeys about these guidelines and whether they exist. They care about being able to access the content they need to do and do the things they need to do. Users are going to find issue with things that they're unable to do. If your goal is a good customer experience or to avoid legal action, start here. So start with WCAG, but that's not your end goal. Chase up blockers and severe issues that aren't being fixed. So there is more to accessibility than just finding and prioritizing issues. They also need to then be fixed. You know, they need to go somewhere. So you couldn't really see it on the previous slides where I was giving examples of these different views on the worksheets, but there would be columns in there for like JIRA tickets or stage of fixed. So Put in regular dates to review progress. Track the progress, the date found, what's its status, link to a ticket, what date and what version of the website or app, which release was it fixed at, so that you've got that audit trail and you can see that the issues are going down. Usability testing and demos are a really powerful way to get buy-in. So if you're struggling to get buy-in across an organization to fix issues, demonstrating the barriers to people, so either through demos or usability testing, it's a really powerful influencer. A lot of the time, the higher up people who make the decisions, who control where the money is spent and where the time is spent, might not see the value if they don't see what the barriers actually are that they're creating. Similar with the different practitioners. So if they haven't been involved in the prioritization workshop and then suddenly they've got these new tickets, they need to understand what the issue is, like why is it causing a barrier? Why does it need fixing? Where's it come from? Waiting until an issue is live is going to add a huge cost. So identify the issues as early in the process as possible. And this comes with time, this comes with practice, this comes with training. So the more aware the broader team is, the more likely this is to happen, where you'll shift that accessibility thinking earlier and earlier in the process. Which is why you need training. So train team members in accessibility. Make sure people know that what their role, what their responsibility is, and how to avoid and identify issues. The more people that know and are aware of it, the more likely you are to be able to fuel this backlog of issues and keep it organised. Embed accessibility in your templates, components, and patterns. And here really I'm talking about documentation as much as possible. So the image that I've added on this slide shows you the Gov UK design system. It's a really good example of how to document components. I love that they include sections like when to use this component, when you shouldn't use this component, like how it works, what it's for. So it's not just giving a code demo. You scroll down on there will be an accessibility section as well on most of them that will go into core considerations for it. So number 9 is ensure everyone knows about the accessibility assets you have and that they're used. So when I say assets, that might mean a design system, training materials, acceptance criteria, testing tools, where this backlog lives, how they can add new issues, making sure that your team knows where to go is really important. And a lot of organizations sadly don't have the accessibility assets. So it's like, this is all about starting to build them up. And remember, number 10, that code reuse saves a huge effort for implementation, testing and fixing. Most sites these days are built in sort of component-based architectures, so most code is reused multiple times, so that's a really good thing. Similar with designs use more design systems now and will reuse stuff, which can save a lot of time and a lot of fixing. So that's a really good thing. And lastly, you'll be glad to know, is use issue tracking to monitor progress and inform training and resources. So that's sort of all about tracking what you've done. So in Jira, we always used to tag anything that was accessibility related. We always used A11Y, so A11Y, accessibility, little short code. We used it in the title, and then we pulled things out into a dashboard in Jira, so we could always see, the developers could see where things were, the testers could see where things were, and everything stayed linked up with our separate spreadsheet with our backlog of issues.